The church bell tolled before dawn. Its voice, forged in iron, tore through the mist-laced fields like a slow scream, remembering something ancient. Each toll seemed to hang in the fog, trembling over thatched rooftops where dew clung like the breath of ghosts. The sky was pale, barely born, and in the hush of pre-sunlight silence, the earth seemed to wait, listening. Inside the cottages, sleep broke without protest. There was no rebellion in the rising, only reverence. Hands calloused from soil reached for coarse wool and cold water. A father kissed a wooden crucifix. A child recited the only Latin they knew, for the bell was not just sound, it was sovereign. It marked the hour, not by the turning of time, but by the bending of the soul, and in the village's heart stood its spine, the church. Built of sandstone and sorrow, its edges were worn smooth by centuries of genuflected knees and pleading lips. The walls had absorbed secrets whispered across lifetimes. Its stained glass flickered with the slow awakening of dawnlight, casting wounds of red and gold upon the flagstone floor. These were not merely windows, but portals, each shard a psalm in glass, each crack a confession. Down the long aisle walked the priest, barefoot, every step a ritual. His robes clung to him like smoke, heavy with incense, heavy with memory. Around his shoulders hung the scent of burning myrrh and old blood. His voice, when he spoke, was low but eternal, whispering Latin as if the syllables themselves were sacred keys. In nomine Patris, et Filii, the words were not for performance. They were spells, not gestures for a watching crowd, but offerings to something ancient, watchful, and perhaps cruel. Before him stood the altar wood, soaked in centuries of hope and hunger. He raised the bread with trembling precision. Not one among the congregation understood the theology, but all knew the fear. They watched, eyes wide, as wheat became flesh, as wine became blood, as power became visible. They did not question. To question was to sin was to be seen. For here the church was not a building, it was breath. It was the unseen hand that touched a baby's forehead at birth, cold with oil and chant. It was the witness at every union, collecting coin for heaven's consent. It was the guide for the dead, its prayers forming ladders for souls no longer breathing. Even the soil bowed to its authority. The planting of seeds, the reaping of wheat, these too were tethered to holy days, inked on ancient calendars, guarded by parchment and pride. But beneath the holy pageantry, something colder pulsed, a different kind of dominion. The priest's eyes, kind in daylight, sharp in candlelight, watched more than prayer. He tallied sins the way a banker tallied debts. He knew who visited whom after dark, who withheld tithes, whose cows bore stillborn calves. Confession was not protection, it was surveillance. A whispered weakness on one Sunday became murmured leverage the next. From the humblest leper to the haughtiest baron, no soul existed outside the web. The baron's will, the widow's fields, the drunkard's bastard child, every secret was tithed, recorded, and remembered. The church had no sword, but it wielded exile, silence, and hellfire with sharper efficiency. Even Rome, distant and gilded, heard whispers from this mud-bound village. A single heresy spoken too loud, too confidently could bloom into fire, and fire left nothing behind but ash and example. Outside, crows circled the spire, their black wings slicing through the morning fog. One landed atop the iron cross, and stared downward, unblinking. Even they seemed to know, even they bent low. The villagers, kneeling on splintered pews, did not weep or rejoice, they submitted. The young girl who had dreamt of running to the forest that night, pressed her knees harder into the wood. The old man who once fought in a forgotten war clutched his rosary, not with hope, but with trembling. The baker, whose hands still smelled of rye and heat, recited each word of the Mass as if his children's next meal depended on it. Perhaps it did. The church did not need to raise its voice. The silence it commanded was enough. Outside the chapel, fields lay veiled in fog, untouched. Chickens scratched softly in their pens, and distant dogs barked at nothing in particular. But no one moved toward work, not yet. The bell had not called them to labor, it had called them to surrender, and surrender they did. The priest moved among them like a shadow, his hand tracing crosses in the air, his breath warm with psalms. A woman sobbed into her shawl, a boy bit his lip to hide his trembling. The very air seemed to hum with held breath. Then came the turning of the page, a cough echoed. A single flame on a nearby candle sputtered and died, its smoke curling upward in a silent scream. The priest paused, just for a moment, but long enough for those who noticed to feel their hearts twist. He resumed the rite, but the silence had been broken. Outside, a wind began to rise. It whistled through the graveyard stones, rattling branches against stained glass like fingernails on old wood. Somewhere, far off, another bell tolled faint and unfamiliar. A messenger on horseback had been seen the night before. His cloak was red, his face hidden. They said he came from the borderlands. They said he carried parchment sealed with wax as dark as dried blood, but no one knew, and no one asked. The congregation bowed once more as the priest lifted the chalice. Ecce Agnus Dei, behold the Lamb of God. A murmur of fear, or was it awe, moved through the crowd. In that moment, the church was not merely brick and glass, it was breath, it was dominion, it was the silence between thunderclaps, the space between sins. And as the villagers rose, as the crows cried out, and as the priest extinguished the final candle, a new kind of silence settled, one that did not comfort, one that promised a reckoning, for not all things could remain hidden forever, and not even the church could silence the wind. The funeral began at twilight. A crow cried once from the steeple, then silence descended like fog. Beneath the swollen sky, villagers pressed together in trembling reverence, clutching sprigs of rosemary, not for fragrance, but for remembrance. The scent of myrrh snaked through the air, clinging to skin and sorrow. Even the children, usually restless, stood motionless. In this moment, time no longer belonged to the sun or the soil, it belonged to the dead, and to the church. The corpse lay still, wrapped in sackcloth as coarse as the earth from which he'd come. No shoes adorned his feet, for the dead walked barefoot to paradise, or so the priest said, his voice always laced with ash and warning. The man had been a cooper, known for his silence and his honest hands. But none spoke his name now. Not aloud, for in death names became possessions, and the church claimed all. Bells rang from the tower, deep and deliberate, not in mourning, but in dominion. Each toll a reminder, death was not an escape, it was a summons, and the church would collect. The priest moved like shadow, his black cloak frayed at the hem, but his authority untouched. He held aloft an iron crucifix, rusted, cold, unyielding, not a beacon of love, but a blade of judgment. His Latin echoed through the clearing, words older than the stone beneath their feet, understood by none, feared by all. Behind him, two altar boys swayed with the weight of censers, smoke rolled from their vessels, like spirits loosed from purgatory. Their hands, raw and red, told stories of penance performed long before understanding. A woman wept softly behind her veil. A man whispered a prayer he half remembered, but all eyes stayed low. To meet the gaze of the priest was to invite scrutiny, and scrutiny begot suspicion. In this place, even time bowed to liturgy. The rooster did not herald the dawn, Mashins did. The sun was just a lamp hung by God, it had no voice here. Market days and moots shifted, to suit feast days and fasts. Marriages waited for banns read thrice, like spells cast to protect against scandal. Even storms, it was said, were forecast not by clouds, but by dreams, murmured by monks, interpreted through relics wrapped in velvet. The priest owned no field, but every harvest passed beneath his eye. Through threat of excommunication, he could starve a man without touching him. Through indulgences, he could strip a family bare and call it redemption. He knew who skipped mass, who muttered about relics, who healed with yarrow and smoke instead of prayer and salt. Inside the church, the stone turned colder, the altar did not glow, it glared, not guarded by angels, but by law. Iron-bound and veiled, the tithe chest sat like a dragon's hoard, fuller than the granary, hungrier than winter. A single candle flickered before the carved face of Saint Apollonia, patron of pain, her expression twisted in divine agony. Children avoided her eyes, and yet, in the night, they still dreamed of her mouthless face. The frescoes behind the altar bled fire and torment. Demons writhed in the plaster, pulling souls by their hair into gullets of flame. A warning, not a lesson. For sin was not forgiven. Here it was watched, weighed, whispered into the priest's ear during confession, then stored like kindling. As the last prayer dwindled, the grave was sealed with soil and silence. The priest stepped forward and placed a thin wafer the host upon the dead man's chest. It did not shimmer, it did not bless. It branded, for even now, the soul's journey passed through the toll gate of the church. The villagers turned away in quiet retreat, their backs curved like question marks. Had the man found peace, or had he simply been claimed? Behind them, the church remained, its stone spine unbent, its candles still lit, watching. Later, in the stillness that comes only after ritual, the priest knelt alone before the altar. His voice, low and hoarse, whispered into the void. Domin, libera animam ejus. Lord, deliver his soul. But even he did not look toward the heavens. He looked down, always down. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling rosemary stems and forgotten hymns. Somewhere in the dark, a dog howled, not in grief, but in warning, and in the village, shutters were drawn. Not against thieves or wolves, but against dreams. Because in dreams, Saint Apollonia smiled, and the wafer did not dissolve. The first shovel of earth struck the coffin with a dull finality. It was twilight, that aching hour, when the sky forgets its color. Shadows lengthened like spilled ink across the crooked stones of the churchyard. Crows shifted silently on the linden tree above, as if even their wings feared the priest's gaze. A funeral had begun. The air was thick with the scent of myrrh and wet soil. Rosemary sprigs, clutched in trembling hands, wept resin onto woolen sleeves. Men did not cry, but their knuckles whitened. Women wept for all the dead they'd buried before this one. The corpse wore sackcloth. No shoes, for the dead, they said, must walk barefoot to paradise. But some wondered if this man would walk at all, or if the weight of unpaid penance would keep him bound to the earth. Bells rang, not in sorrow, but in dominion. They rang to remind the living who owned death. The village priest stood at the head of the procession, his cloak frayed at the hem, soaked in a lifetime of rain and incense. Yet none mistook him for weak. In his grasp was a crucifix of iron, heavy, unadorned, and sharp at the edges. It was not a symbol of comfort. It was judgment incarnate. His voice rose in Latin, sharp as frost on a birch branch. None understood the words, but they understood their weight. Words that could bind a soul to purgatory, or raise it in theory toward absolution. Two altar boys walked behind him, swinging censers so heavy their shoulders shook. Smoke curled from silver mouths, veiling their red blistered hands, punished not for sin, but for being born into it. This was not a funeral, it was a reckoning. Here time bent to liturgy. The rooster did not summon dawn, matins did. Feasts did not follow harvest, but calendar saints. Storms were not warned by clouds, but by dreams whispered to priests in sleep, and confirmed by relics that never blinked. The priest owned no land, but he ruled it. With a threat of excommunication, he could starve a family without lifting a blade. With indulgences, he could empty a dying man's purse, promising heaven while his children begged for bread. He knew who healed with herbs instead of prayers, who murmured about saints with scorn, who missed mass twice in a fortnight. He knew and he remembered. Inside the church, sacredness wore iron. The altar was not guarded by angels, but by law. The tithe chest sat there iron-bound, veiled in velvet, never full enough. It was heavier than the village granary, and twice as fed. A single candle burned at the altar's side. Saint Apollonia, the patron of pain, gazed down with a broken smile. Her painted eyes watched children dream of hellfire, painted in red so vivid they bled into the soul. They said penance cleansed the spirit, but who washed the stains from the stone? The dead man, his name already slipping from memory, had not left much behind. A rusted sickle, a wife whose silence outlasted the prayers, and a son perhaps, if the rumors held. But what he did leave was a debt to the church. So the priest placed a wafer on the corpse's chest, not for grace, but for ownership. Even in death, the church demanded its toll. The soul must pass through their hands a toll gate to eternity. Without it, paradise was a locked door, and only the priest held the key. The grave digger stepped forward. He did not meet the priest's eye. Shovel after shovel, the earth grew higher, and the man below vanished. The rosemary snapped underfoot. Somewhere, a mother whispered a prayer, not from the Psalms, but from her grandmother, words older than Latin, older than Rome. And the priest heard. He turned. His voice, though soft, sliced the dusk. Blasphemy breeds famine. Witchcraft brings frost. The mother bowed, but her eyes did not. The priest moved on. Another soul filed. Another record kept. Another name entered into books lined with lambskin and threats. He ruled no army. He held no sword. But kingdoms bent more easily under guilt than iron. Behind his church, crops bent toward the monastery's shadow. Laborers tithed with grain before feeding their own. Even joy required permission, marriages forbidden without 3 banns read aloud. And if love bloomed without blessing, it was rooted out like weed from wheat. They said the church saved, but at first condemned. Even the air seemed colder near the chapel. Birds never nested in its beams. The stone walls sweated even in summer, as if remembering confessions they were never meant to hear. The priest walked now among the tombs, whispering psalms not for the dead, but for himself, not prayers, warnings. Even he, perhaps, feared the silence of soil. Behind him, the altar boys snuffed the candles. Smoke curled like ghosts toward the beams. The frescoes of hellfire flickered one last time. Children screamed in sleep again that night, clutching their bellies as if flames already licked their ribs. In the village, the silence of night began. But it was not peace, it was held breath. One woman, widowed twice, lit a lantern. Its oil was blessed, and she did not trust it. Her fingers trembled not from cold, but memory. She remembered a time before this priest. A time when death meant mourning, not transaction. When the stars guided farmers, not relics. When saints healed, not judged. But memory was dangerous. She doused the light. In the graveyard, the last stone was patted smooth. A crow called once and vanished. The grave was sealed, but peace did not follow. In that stillness, a wind rose not cold, not warm, but strange. It twisted around the chapel's spire, ruffled the thatched roofs, then vanished into the woods beyond. Something had shifted, something unseen, and as the moon climbed behind clouds thick as wool, the priest paused at the threshold of the church. His fingers clutched the iron cross just a little tighter, because something in the wind smelled not of death, but defiance, and it was coming. The village square echoed with hoofbeats and murmurs. A distant bell had not rung, yet the air was thick, as though it had mist clung to the ankles of those gathered, rising like unspoken guilt. The hooves belonged not to a soldier, nor a noble courier, but to a man draped in a robe sewn from the miles he had crossed. His eyes shimmered with knowledge, and with fire. The children watched first, always the first to sense what the world won't say. One girl clutched her doll tighter, backing behind her mother's skirt. A boy laughed nervously, until the friar's gaze met his and silenced him. It was not hatred, nor warmth, just something old, too old for a child's bones. The friar dismounted without a word. Dust shook from his hems, revealing layers of path and pilgrimage. He did not ask for bread, nor beg for lodging. Instead, he opened a weathered satchel and removed a roll of parchment, and a crucifix carved not from oak or ivory, but bone. And still, no one spoke. He went from door to door, not knocking, only waiting. And each time the door opened, the villagers had seen friars before, but not like him. This one didn't bless the sheep or sprinkle the wells. He listened, and worse, he remembered. In one house, he sat by the hearth where the ashes had long gone cold. "You took bread from your neighbor's child," he said softly, not as accusation but as statement. The woman flinched, the way a wound flinches when the bandage is removed. She nodded once. He did not ask why. In another house, he faced a father who would not meet his eyes. "You held hatred in your chest for your wife. You wished her to fall ill, and in your thoughts, you saw her burial." The man sobbed, the friar waited, then dipped his quill and wrote. For each sin, whispered or drawn out by silence, he made an entry. The parchment grew heavy with ink. Names were not used, only deeds. Like a ghost inventory of the village's soul, line after line scratched deeper into the conscience of the people. Some sins were small, brittle as a dry twig, others were cavernous, without end. The friar asked not only for coin, but for confession, not loud, not public whispered. A sin, once confessed, could be exchanged for grace. But grace had its price. Sometimes in copper, sometimes in labor, sometimes in secrets, traded like foreign coin. He offered indulgences, parchment seals of pardon, signed in Rome's shadow. He never claimed they would save their souls, only that it was better to have one than none. The village priest watched from his pulpit with clenched knuckles. He delivered his sermons with trembling lips, for he knew the people were not listening to him anymore. His authority, long bolstered by scripture and sacrament, was being hollowed by the friar's presence. He tried to remind them of humility, of truth, of trust in their own priest, but the flock had already wandered, and the church spoke with many tongues. The bishop had sent no warning, Rome had sent no seal, the friar answered to no one in the village, not even to the priest, yet no one dared to defy him. Justice became a spectacle. A man accused of reading banned texts, tales of stars and alchemy, was not burned, but tied to the market cross. There he stood for 3 days, while the villagers prayed around him. No one spoke to him, only near him. His punishment was not fire, but isolation under divine gaze. That was enough. The friar spoke once at twilight, as ravens circled above the steeple. "There is rot beneath your soil," he said. "Not in the earth, but in your memories. What you've buried will sprout thorns." Children who once played near the chapel now avoided it. They said they heard singing, not hymns, but chants, without words. A rhythm that beat like a second heart beneath the altar. One girl claimed she saw the friar levitate in his sleep. No one dared to challenge her. No one dared to repeat it. Each night, he locked himself inside the chapel. The doors groaned behind him, like an iron stomach, and then, silence. Except in dreams. The villagers began to dream of him, even those who swore they hadn't spoken to him. In these dreams, he drifted through their homes like incense, leaning over cribs and hearths. His whisper came without breath, naming the things they feared even to think. One woman awoke screaming, sure she had told him about the child she lost, the one she never admitted existed. Another man was found praying in the fields before dawn, trembling, whispering, he knows what I wished upon my brother." By morning, the friar was gone. No goodbye, no final sermon, no footprint in the dew-soaked grass. The chapel door hung ajar, but inside, only dust remained, and parchment. A single sheet, unrolled upon the altar, blank except for one sentence, "The record is kept." The villagers burned it, fearing it was cursed, but the fear did not leave. It lingered in the rafters, in the hay, in the way they now looked at each other, unsure of who had confessed what. Trust unraveled like frayed rope. Even the priest kept glancing over his shoulder, as if expecting the friar to return, or to find him waiting. Life resumed. Carts rolled, chickens pecked, but a silence grew between the homes, one that no bell could break. At night, fires burned lower, doors latched sooner, and the chapel, once a place of solace, stood empty, cold, hollow. They say faith binds, but when faith wears many faces, it becomes a maze, and some who enter never find their way back out. As the leaves browned and the wind turned cruel, another rider entered the village. But this one wore crimson. A papal seal glinted at his belt. He came not to ask questions, but to give orders. He did not stay long. He asked for the chapel records. He found only ash. He asked for the friar's name. No one spoke it. He asked what sins had been revealed. Everyone looked to the ground, as if afraid their shadows would answer. Then he too left, but not before placing a new lock on the chapel door, and nailing a notice above it. No one dared read it aloud, but in the night, someone wept beneath it. Somewhere beyond the hills, torches flickered like stars against the dark, and the path of the church continued on, winding not toward salvation, but something else, something watching, waiting. The wind shifted, and in the far distance, a child screamed. Rain fell like a sentence whispered by a vengeful sky, slow, deliberate, without mercy. The village paths had disappeared beneath sheets of glistening mud, turning every step into a struggle, every journey into penance. Beneath the eaves of the old stone church, a beggar knelt draped in a ragged cloak, moss-covered and wet with sorrow. His breath came in clouds. No one stopped. No one looked. His outstretched hand trembled like a dying branch in the wind, until the door creaked. The priest emerged, not with a sermon, but with a crusted loaf, still warm. He placed it gently on the stones before the beggar, as though offering communion to the forgotten. Mercy, when performed beneath the crucifix, was safe, pious, contained. Inside, the church hummed with life that dared not speak its name. The brazier crackled in the center, casting amber ghosts along the walls. Wax dripped steadily from altar candles, merging with the scent of wet wool, dust, and red wine. Silence was not absence here, it was ritual, reverent, heavy. Above the altar, the great tapestry of the harrowing hung like a frozen vision, Christ descending into hell, lantern lifted, eyes unflinching before the abyss. His robes were stitched in crimson and gold, his bare feet barely brushing the serpent's coils. Every child in the village had stared at that tapestry until it burned behind their eyelids, memorizing its folds, not as art, but as instruction. A map through the underworld. A warning cloaked in silk. Here, catechism was not merely taught, it was lived. Latin verses were whispered before children could count. Girls sewed saints' names into cloth, before they ever dared to dream of love. Birth was the church's to bless. Death, the church's to define. In between, a life of confession spoken or enforced. The bishop's manor stood above it all, a fortress of stone and quiet judgment. Though his visits were rare, his influence arrived daily in the form of taxes, decrees, and silent expectations. His ring, a golden oval pressed into wax, sealed every bargain, every inheritance, every punishment. To some, he was a shepherd, to most, a shadow on the hill. But there was one who cast a darker one still. Once, each year, the inquisitor arrived, black-cloaked and pale as winter bone. No trumpet, no herald, just hoofbeats at dawn and questions that pierced deeper than any sword. His voice was soft, always soft, but his eyes, they measured souls like grain. He did not ask only about witches, he asked why the smith never knelt at Easter Mass. He asked why the widow kept bees but refused to share honey with the priest. He asked why the midwife used herbs wrapped in ash bark rather than holy water, when a child refused to cry at birth. And though the church never built gallows in this village, the inquisitor never needed rope. His questions planted silence, and silence grew suspicion. One by one, villagers learned to hold their tongues, to offer second glances, to pray louder, to confess sins they did not yet commit just in case. This year, the rain greeted him. As Vespers bells tolled through fog, a figure stepped into the nave, dripping and quiet. The girl saw him first, the same one who had spun the altar cloths as a child, who had once wept beneath the harrowing tapestry after her brother died from the winter fever. She now placed her palm against the stone wall near the apse stone chilled by centuries of breath and blood and blessing. But tonight, it felt warm. Like something pulsed beneath it. Something alive. The Inquisitor knelt beside the fire. He spoke to no one. His eyes did not move, but the air shifted around him, like branches bending before a storm not yet seen, only felt. At dawn, he would begin. He would summon the smith, the widow, the midwife. He would ask of secrets whispered over bread, of dreams remembered too clearly, of bloodlines that bore strange births, and the village would hold its breath, waiting not for answers but for silence, for the kind that comes before exile, before fire, before forgetting. But that night, as the rain deepened and the wind carried faint hymns through the lattice windows, the girl remained by the wall, her palm pressed flat, her breath shallow. She did not know why, only that it beat, like a buried heart. A pulse, not of fear, but of witness. Above her, the tapestry trembled ever so slightly. Perhaps from draught, or something else. The fire cracked once sharp as a command. The Inquisitor did not flinch. In the village below, children huddled in sleep, their dreams woven with saints and storms. Mothers whispered prayers into the hems of tunics. Fathers placed salt along thresholds, and the beggar, still wet, still shivering, clutched the crust of bread like a holy relic. The church was not a building, it was breath, and bindings, and the stories people told themselves to survive the judgment of others. And as the last bell tolled, its sound echoing like footsteps down a long corridor of stone and fear, the girl turned her hand not away from the wall, but into it. Fingers splayed. Listening, something had awakened, not just within stone, but within her. A question, a defiance, a light, too faint to name, yet too fierce to extinguish. Tomorrow, the Inquisition would begin. But tonight, the wall remembered. The bonfire hissed as resin popped in the flames, like secrets trying to escape the timber. Smoke curled into the twilight, not in freedom, but in ritual. The village festival had begun. Children chased each other between booths of barley bread and carved apples, their laughter high and wild, but it never rose too far. Like a tether pulled tight, invisible lines kept joy from straying. Because even in celebration, the church stood watch. Colored pennants fluttered, like captive butterflies above the crowd, tethered to tall poles crowned with iron crosses. They danced with the wind, not the will of the people. And below them men in woolen cloaks and linen shifts spun in concentric circles, hands linked, feet drumming the dirt in rhythm, not to the pulse of harvest, but to Saint Alaric the martyr. Few remembered what Alaric had done, fewer dared ask. His story had faded into doctrine long ago, recited with closed eyes and dry mouths. But his name still echoed in every toast, carved above every archway, whispered before the mead met the tongue. A hush had fallen earlier, when the priest entered. His cassock swept the stones like smoke. In one hand, a brass aspergillum, dripping with holy water. In the other, a worn Bible, whose pages knew more wine than ink. He moved through the crowd, not like a man but a veil between heaven and hunger, sprinkling, muttering, judging. Only when he lifted the host, gleaming pale in the firelight like a shard of moon, did the feasting begin. Only with his nod did the dancing rise. In his silence, even the dogs stopped barking. A group of young men sang a ballad near the pig roast, voices lilting and wild. But when the verses turned bawdy, a tale of a maiden and a river god, a sharp cough from the priest ended the merriment. Mid-verse, laughter froze in their throats. One of them looked down at his feet, ashamed. Another blinked fast, as if waking from a dream. The sacred and the profane were neighbors here. Their houses shared a wall, and the church held the keys to both. Beneath a braided canopy of ivy and linen, a boy no older than 16 knelt before a girl, flushed and trembling, a copper ring in his outstretched hand. Her smile bloomed slow and wide, like spring rising from snow, but it did not last. A nearby elder tapped his staff twice against the earth. The gesture was quiet, final. No banns had been read, no dowry confirmed. Their love as bright and sudden as a lightning flash would wait behind stone and schedule. Perhaps it would die there. A monk sat in the shadows beyond the firelight, a thin man with ink-stained fingers and a cloak heavy with years. Upon his lap lay a vellum book, its pages half filled with charcoal sketches. He watched everything. The twirl of a dancer's skirt, the shared glance between boys, the way an old woman whispered into a knot of herbs. He sketched not for beauty, but for proof. Magic did not vanish, it merely changed its dress. And tonight, joy wore robes that barely disguised the ancient things beneath. A girl wove flowers into a wreath near the fire, not daisies or rosemary, but rowan berries and yarrow. Her fingers moved fast, too practiced. An old charm, a forgotten one. The monk's charcoal paused. He watched. She looked up once, just once, and their eyes met. She smiled. He did not. The fire began to die around midnight. The embers pulsed like a sleeping heart, red and slow. Children slept in their mother's arms, dreamless and warm. The drums had ceased, replaced now by a hymn. It was not a hymn of praise, but habit. The villagers sang it softly, swaying, their voices dulled by wine and weariness. It spoke of sacrifice, of Saint Alaric's blade and blood, of the holy fire that purified the old ways. But in their tone, there was neither fervor nor fear, only something strange. A unity that hurt to hear. A melody of resignation. The priest stood again. He did not sing. He watched them, arms crossed, eyes unreadable, like a shepherd, unsure if his flock still feared the wolves. In the corner, the monk closed his book. On the final page, he'd drawn the girl with the flower crown, but behind her loomed a shape in shadow, horned and half-formed. He knew what he'd seen, or thought he'd seen. It would be reported, quietly, carefully. The last torch went out not with ceremony, but with a sigh. In the darkness, the village returned to itself, stripped of its colors, its song, its stage. Only ash remained. And footsteps on damp soil. One man lingered, a stonemason, with hands like broken bark. He stared into the coals long after they died, eyes reflecting nothing. His daughter had danced with a tanner's boy tonight. She had smiled, he had seen it, and it filled him with dread, because tomorrow the priest would come, with questions, with judgments, with penance. The church had not forbidden joy, it had simply claimed it, tamed it, packaged it in gold and gilt, and every soul knew beauty was allowed only when sanctioned, otherwise, it burned. In the distance the first bell of morning began to toll, slow, hollow. As the sound drifted across the field, the mist returned soft and white, curling around the stones like memory. The monk walked through it, his silhouette consumed inch by inch, until only the sound of his steps remained. And somewhere, unseen, a girl's wreath of rowan berries fell into the stream. It floated for a moment, perfect, untouched, then vanished.